Welcome to this week's CEMLA research webinar. This week we have the pleasure of having Kólver Hernández, who is Deputy Manager for Monetary Research here at CEMLA. Kólver's interest lies in international macroeconomics, monetary economics, and macroeconomics. He has held assistant professor positions at the University of Delaware and the Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, and he graduated with a PhD in economics from Boston College in 2005, and he has undergraduate studies from the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. Kólver has made important contributions on methods to solve generally clearing models. He has publications on system reduction method to efficiently solve he has also there an interest.
So thank you everybody for joining the webinar today. First, let me go with the usual disclaimer. The views expressed in this webinar are my own, and they do not represent the official views of CEMLA. And also, let me tell you that this is a joint work with Asli Lebrevigioglu from UT Dallas. Asli is actually on the webinar, so in case you have some questions that I cannot answer, Asli is going to be able to answer your questions. And if you have questions for her, please also ask the questions either by typing on the chat window, or just open your microphones, and then I guess someone is going to give you access to the sound. Okay, so the title of the paper is The Transmission of US Shocks to Emerging Markets. And to motivate the talk, let me just first show you a picture of 4 countries. Is the growth of the US, Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. Blue line is the US, and the light blue GDP growth for uh, for Canada. Uh, so one of the things that I is you blue the one for the Canada. What you can follow each other. Mostly and what that means that they are very correct. Not so much, we don't see that as strong as correlation for Mexico and Brazil, for example, because there are some periods in which we have our own crises, such as the tequila crisis in Mexico and the samba crisis in Brazil. And we have more volatility, and they are less correlated than the other two economies. So how is that we can address or try to understand these correlations, and beyond that, how is that we try to understand some causalities? Well, in the literature, we have been trying to address this causality in two ways. One is with empirical studies, and one with theoretical studies. In the that try to understand these causalities by highlighting two different channels. On one hand, we have the work, for example, of Smith Rohe and Justinian Preston, in which they try to highlight mostly the trade channel. So they point out, and these papers are for Canada and the US, and they try to understand the strong correlation for Canada and the US, and more importantly, going to causality from the US to Canada, highlighting the trade channels. On the other hand, we have work, for example, by Neumayer and Perry and Uribe, in which this branch of the literature tries to emphasize the financial linkages with in international markets. So basically what this other branch of the literature is highlighting is the exposure of emerging markets to international markets, international financial markets, and therefore their volatility and correlations with other countries. So the approach that we follow here in this paper is basically to endogenize and try to address both channels at the same time in a model. So let me start by basically giving you a picture of the model, and this is going to also help me to introduce some notation here. So we model with some detail two economies. We model the US and Mexico, and we assume that these two economies have two sectors, a non-tradable sector and tradable sector. And in our modeling approach, we actually treat both countries symmetrically in the functional forms, and we allow the parameter specific for each country that we estimate, and that will make give us the so we have a tradable channel, a tradable sector, and by modeling both economies, what we gain is that we actually are able to endogenize the demands of Mexican goods in the US, that will be an export for Mexico, and we also are able to endogenize the demand of US goods in Mexico, and that will be an import for Mexico. So we allow for export and imports of two types of goods, consumption and investment. So basically what we have is the traditional trade channel. There are some other ways model trade, for example, by vertical integration, or for example, by by modern reacts in this paper with the simplest possible um, a way to trade and by just modeling demands, the regular demands and supply for foreign goods. So additionally to bilateral trade in the model, we also allow for trade with the rest of the world. And this is so that we don't impose a very stringent trade relationships with the US and Mexico. And here the point is that for Mexico, the US market is perhaps the most important market, but for the US, the Mexican market is not the most important. And allow for that participation of other markets, we model the rest of the world somehow in a convenient way. On the other channel, on the financial channel, what we do is we follow very closely the work of Cristiano Moton Rostaño, and we assume that here we have a consumer that in the US that actually makes deposits on a financial intermediary, and the financial intermediary lends money to risky entrepreneurs, and they design an optimal contract in which they determine the risky rate. And by modeling that in the US, what we obtain is a risky spread. We use to the risk to try to discipline this channel. Also, I forgot to mention, but the point here on the trade channel is that we also have data on bilateral trade and trade with the rest of the world, and data on the exchange rate to discipline this trade channel. So going back to the financial channel, so we have this bank, this financial intermediary, also lending money to the Mexican entrepreneur. So there is a similar contract made between the US financial intermediary and the Mexican entrepreneur, and that endogenously deliver a risk spread. So we understand that there are several modeling choices here to make, and this is one of them. So we took this approach of one big international bank, but we also consider an alternative in which in this in this is that the in Mexico. Mexican make deposits in the financial intermediary. The financial intermediary establishes optimal contract with risk entrepreneurs, and in that way we obtain endogenously a country spread. What we obtained empirically is that these two modeling choices are not that relevant to capture the exposure of Mexico to the U.S. And now, and here we also are aware of other possible details. For example, that the loans here, in both cases, we are assuming that in both cases the risk entrepreneur is actually borrowing in US dollars. However, the risk entrepreneur is getting revenues in pesos, so the risk entrepreneur is fully exposed to the exchange rate. The reason why we decided to, obviously reality is somewhere in between. We don't have that all loans are made in US dollars. We also have that many loans are made in Mexican pesos. However, the reason for this modeling choice is because the data that we have, this risk, country risk, is the MB plus spread, which reflects basically the spread between sovereign bonds and in Mexico and the US in US dollars. So here there are some papers that have shown that sovereign bonds actually follow very closely corporate bonds, which is what we are trying to capture. But we don't have the information on corporate spread, so we use the MB spread. Here for the US, we follow Cristiano Moton-Rostaño, and what we created here is the corporate spread of AAA bonds versus BBA. Experiment, and we allow for a financial intermediaries in Mexico to lend money in pesos, so that the risk entrepreneur doesn't run the full is not fully exposed a counterpart for the observable, because in that case, or observable, the MB spread does not include any exchange rate exposure. So in any event, those are more in all those three cases. And let me I see Victoria has a question. It says, in the previous case, there are no Mexican financial intermediaries. That's correct. In what we are going to US entrepreneur and the Mexican entrepreneur. Now, how realistic is that? Is obviously is modeling choices are reality in Mexico. My point is that if we assume that there is one big financial intermediary financing Mexican entrepreneurs, we obtain similar results in capturing these spillovers from the US to Mexico. And obviously, reality is a convex combination but basically the model is able to capture those correlations, those exposures in any so additionally to that, we have that consumers in the US and in Mexico, they are able to borrow from the rest of the world, and this is to allow consumers to smooth out consumption. Now, even though in this second case, it doesn't seem to be between Mexico and the US through the rest of the world. So the rest of the world here has to establish an uncovered interest parity condition. And the same is true in what I call the benchmark case, in which there is one big international financial intermediary. We also have that the rest of the world actually has to pin down a uncovered interest parity condition. I see that Carolina is asking, Mexican commodities mainly exported to the US, and how do commodity prices enter in the trade channel? Well, a big part of the commodities that Mexico export are oil, and we did not allow, we did not model specifically the commodities actually long ago. I was almost forgetting. Long ago, we tried to separate Mexican exports here in our data. Let me just go back to the trade channel. We try to separate oil exports from and we didn't get too much different results for the trade channel. But I mean, it's a very important aspect that we need to expand later on in our model and to consider commodities. Of Mexican goods exported to the US to match the data. No, okay. So let me go back to commodity prices here. We don't have a particular good that we call commodity, and we don't model it as a exports, and we have two types of exports: consumption and investment. Now, investment is part of this that goes into the production function, but is not treated differently are endogenous. They have an endogenous component. However, we allow, I forgot to put here the shock, but we allow for an exogenous pointing out these prices are determined internationally, and they are not fully determined by the US and Mexico, regardless of what they are trading, because this is international trade. And actually in our estimations, we find out that terms of trade shock, we call it, plays an important role to explain the price. Demand exports. Yes. Yes, so these two goods are traded internationally. We have an endogenous demand, an endogenous supply, and an endogenous price. So for all the trade that happens across these two countries. I hope that clarified things. Okay. So going back to the financial side of the model, as I mentioned, just quickly to summarize, there are many ways to model the international financial relationships. The one that we are calling, the one that I'm going to show you today is this big international bank. But literally for the results that you're going to see, there is virtually no difference between this modeling choice and the alternative of having two domestic banks in each country. And I want to point out two things. One is that the exchange rate plays an important role because it plays a dual role here in the financial channel, because the Mexican also in the trade channel, the exchange rate obviously plays an important role to pin down the international prices. That's one thing. So the exchange rate is important because it plays a dual role, and the other investment also plays a dual role in the sense that through the financial entrepreneur is going to produce a capital, and that capital is going to go directly to the production function of the tradable goods. So trade and the investment channel, in the trade and the financial channel. So once we put the two things together, the two channels together, the point that I was trying is they're actually very related, and they are highly related through the through capital. The risk entrepreneur is okay. So we have a dual role here for capital, or in our case, the observable of the exchange rate, because the Mexican entrepreneur is fully exposed to the exchange rate, and because the exchange rate is very important for trade and to determine the prices in the trade. So let me now go through some more details. So what we use is we use 16 quarterly time series for Mexico and the US. The sample that we cover is from 1994 to 2012. And we estimate this model to address three questions. The first is the standard question, what are the driving forces of the Mexican business cycle? The second question is, what is the historical impact of US shocks in the Mexican economy? And the third question is, obviously, what are the roles of trade linkages and financial linkages into the exposure of Mexico to the US? I think the most important part here of the data that we are using is that we are using data that dissipates and also for the trade channel we use bilateral trade, bilateral imports, bilateral exports, and the exchange rate. The rest of the other variables that we use are the standard macro variables, GDP, consumption, investment, government, etc. So I'll describe that in a little bit more. So let me go with the main findings of the paper. First, let me highlight two I consider very important finding is that actually the estimated model is able to capture correlations that we see in the data, the correlations that I show you with the GDP in the first picture. So let me explain this what I have here. On the left-hand side, what I have is the gray area is data, 95% confidence interval for the data. And the blue line represents the model prediction. So this is what the model actually predicts. Victoria's question. No, we only use the MB plus spread, which capture the default risk of the country. AAA corporate bonds against BBB bonds or BBA bonds. It's the same measure that Cristiano uses for the US, and we couldn't construct the same measure for Mexico because there is no data on that. So that's what we use. And just to compare the result of why is that I'm highlighting that result so strongly is because there is this paper by Justiniano and Preston, J. 2010, in which they tried to estimate the US, and what they find is that the model predictions are the gray line here, and the data from Canada and the US are the black line. The models, or what they call a standard small open economy model, actually cannot capture the correlations that we see in the data. And obviously, to publish a effort in trying to capture what you did, trying to capture what you see in the data. So just in this paper, they cite a lot of other papers that actually and voters for the US and Europe. That paper is not about the spillovers, but in the tables you can actually see that there is no correlation between Europe and or the model predicts no correlation between Europe and the US. And here what they obtain is that the model cannot predict any correlation between Canada and the US. So that's, I think, the first important finding is to, when you go beyond the standard small open economy and you model in detail, in a lot of detail, both the trade channel and the financial channel, you actually can capture those correlations that we see in the data. The second econometric finding here is that we endogenously obtain the small open economy characteristic of Mexico, and let me answer one question. Alberto is asking some intuition of the key mechanisms that allow for you to get this correlation. Yes, actually, I'm gonna get to that later in the presentation, the key mechanisms. But in essence, let me actually, to answer, give me 1 second, Alberto, I'll answer your question. So just let me also mention that we endogenously obtain that Mexico does not have any impact in the US. And I'll make clear why that is important later in a second. It's obvious, I know it's obvious that Mexico is not gonna have a strong effect in the US, but the fact that in reality it's obvious doesn't mean that you're gonna get that econometrically with a DSE or with a VAR. So I'll make that clear in a second. So going back to the Alberto's questions here. So what are the mechanisms? So basically, the mechanisms are both trade and the financial linkages. So for example, consider a technology shock in the US. Through which this shock is going to affect the rest of the economy. The first is going to be affect the country risk. If it is a positive technology shock, it's going to entrepreneurs borrowing, and if it is a negative shock, it's going to deteriorate that. It's going to make it more riskier. And at the same time, if a positive technology shock will actually increase the demand both through this alternative channel. So that's the main, the basic intuition. Okay. So I guess the Alberto's question perhaps also has to do with why is that I get that correlations and the other studies cannot. And I think is we are able to get those two correlations, because this mechanism allows for to accommodate the movements that we see in the data of not only of GDPs but consumption, investment, etc. I'll show you that in one more second. So I guess my main point is that by modeling these two channels endogenously, fully endogenously, you actually are able to get those correlations because these two mechanisms make those correlations in the model as strong as we see in the data. And when you do not, for example, if you model a small open economy, financial channel and the trade channel. So because these two are not going to be coordinated. In the case of a small open economy, these two are assumed as exogenously. You are not going to have the question. Julio is asking, what happens with the correlation when you have a financial autarky, and do you okay, so yes, I know what happens with the correlation with we assume financial autarky and the correlations fully disappear. Actually, we call this the Justiniano result. So basically, we do an experiment in which, and then we obtain that the correlations that the model predicts are exactly similar to Justiniano's correlations. Basically, the model is unable No, I don't. I don't. Actually, that's an interesting question. I think we need to find out that. But here we have two extremes. One is 100% in this so-called benchmark model, and the other option is 0%. So, and in both cases we have that these mechanisms work similarly in the model. Okay, Caroline is asking, so the Mexican spread is determined in the US entirely? Yes, in this, under the benchmark assumption, it is for the spread is determined optimally endogenously in the model. So it's not fully up to the US financial intermediary to determine the spread, the country risk, because it also depends on the net worth of the Mexican entrepreneur, which is a Mexican variable. So not fully determined by the US. The spread is determined both endogenously, but by Mexican variables and US variables. But it's not, yeah, I guess. Correlation, the model predicts zero correlation between Canada and the US, and we're able to find a correlation that is consistent with the data. So that's our first econometric result. Now, the explains 70%, around 70% of the variation of Mexico's GDP growth, and this is the most important, the largest source of economic fluctuations for Mexico. estimate a structural bar with our own data set following the methodology of small open economies by Tausa, and we obtain a similar find some guidance on this number, if this number was in line with the literature or not. What we found is a couple of papers. Makowiak find that the external shocks explains 50% of Mexican GDP in general, external shocks. And Canova finds that the external shocks explain the literature, if you wish, if you consider this as the main external shocks. Also, we find that the transmission of shocks occurs through the business cycle, so it's in every quarter we find a lot of which is a homemade crisis. We don't find that the U.S. had any important, any significant impact in that particular business cycle. So the other finding is that Mexico during recessions, for example, in the 2001 and 2008 recessions. So I show you some pictures later, and we can discuss some numbers later in the presentation. Finally, I think this goes back to Julio's question. We consider two counterfactual experiments. In one experiment, variables constant, so not allowing for those variables to be any source of fluctuations. And we did the same similar experiment for the financial channel. Through which we capture the exposure of Mexico is through the financial channel. Additionally, we did another experiment in which we remove all the financial part of the model, which will be closer to what so we obtain that by removing the financial channel, we obtain results very close to what Justiniano finds. Basically, if we remove the financial channel in our model, we obtain zero correlations of this type as in Justiniano's paper. The model, we have a consumer. We're going to have a consumer. I mentioned that the consumer is going to make deposits on the financial intermediary, but the consumer is also going to consume, so it's going to have a consumption basket. We have final good producers. We have two final good producers, the non part of the financial part of the model. We have an entrepreneur that is going to borrow and endogenously determine a country risk. We have the financial intermediary. Then we have some exporters, and this goes back to the question succinctly model some exporters, and they take those endogenous prices and they add some other stochastic components. So we allow for those prices to be not fully endogenous in the model, but with a shock. And then so here we have the household. And before I forget, I'm gonna all the shocks that we include in the model are with red, are highlighted with red. So if I forget to mention that this is a shock, well, then you just, if you see it in red, it's a shock. So we have these preferences for both we didn't know exactly at the beginning of our research what type of preference we knew for Mexico, but we didn't know for the U.S. If it was okay to model the U.S. with this type of preferences, this type of and we know GHH preferences in emerging markets a lot because those are the preferences that um, um, Mendoza and Uribe and many others have pointed out that work very nicely to model emerging economies. But it was until recently in an econometric paper and in his estimation for the US, and in his estimation, he obtains that for the US, it is the data would prefer a type of preferences very close to GHH preferences. So we adopt this type of preferences for both Mexico. Row, and we have a labor basket of two types of labor in the tradable sector and the non-tradable sector. So the basket in the tradable sector is just composed by this CES aggregator with labor in these two sectors, in the tradable and the non-tradable sector. Then we have consumption form as a set of sub-baskets. So we have that we have a basket for tradable goods, and we have a basket of non-tradable goods. And this parameter theta that we see in the literature, and I'm mentioning this parameter theta because there is a discussion in the literature about the role of this parameter theta in the transmission mechanisms of international shocks. What I'm trying to say here is this is basically how we model the trade channel, very straightforward, very standard. In the trade basket, we have the home produced goods for Mexico, the foreign good, which is the US mainly because of the US. Um, okay, yes, sorry, I forgot to, it doesn't, it does, yes, Victoria is asking, why do you have a labor supply shock? So it doesn't have what we can call a labor supply shock. Thanks, Victoria. So this is basically how we model the demands of, this will be the imports from the US, and this will be imports from the rest of the world, from Mexico. And similarly, we have similar baskets for the US. Now, this parameter omega, together with the parameter theta, again, have been discussed in the literature. I'll mention what we did that with those parameters later. So finally, we have the budget constraint, and here is where we can see a kind of a labor shock. So the sources of funds come from labor, so the payroll, and the uses of funds are consumption and taxes. And B is a bond with the rest of the world for the Mexican consumer. This WH, W star, is different from the W that the firm actually pays. So we assume that there is a union. We follow pretty much the story that is described in the paper by that actually charges a salary W without the star to the firm, and pays W star to the worker. And the difference is the difference, the gap, is what we're going to refer to as the markup labor shock. Receives a lot of transfers. These transfers include all the transfers from the firms, the final good producers, capital producers, entrepreneurs, etc. The US household is treated symmetrically, so I'm not gonna talk saying too much about the US because it's symmetrically. Three types of bonds. One bond, which is the tilde bond, is to finance the US entrepreneur. The non-B tilde bond is to finance the Mexican entrepreneur, and the B tilde O bond is to with the rest of the world. Another feature and this is, as you know, to be able to find the terminus in the model. This is a technical term that we have to have. Okay, so on the production side, what we have is a technology sector-specific shock. So we have these technologies with technology shock. So the non-tradable shock is two financial contracts to finance capital, one in Mexico and one in the US. And if we were to have two different types of capital, we would have to have four financial contracts, but this is purely for technologies. We adopt this as this modeling choice of input adjustment costs. These are quadratic costs in inputs, and for this we follow Basu and Shapiro, or Island and Shu. And why is that important in our case? Well, just when you think about it, nationally, if you don't have these input adjustment costs, and you have a positive innovation in the US, the international resources are going to move towards the US, and in particular, investment is going to move away from Mexico and towards the US, and that will actually give you a negative correlation of less easy or with a friction, and the modeling choice that we adopt here is the input adjustment costs. Okay, so the parameter pi in the determination of that. Let me go back to these parameters pi. So the way in which we determine this is just basically a parameter that we calibrate. I don't remember the exact number, but it's a small number, and it's just purely calibrated to see how things change. There is this paper by Uribe and Smith-Grohe, closing small open economy models, and they show several ways to model to make adjustments to the model to have the determinants in small open economies or open economies. They find that parameter pi is on the volatility of the variables, but we obtain so basically keeping everything constant. If you move pi, either you obtain slightly more volatile variables or slightly less volatile variables, but we obtain very similar. So that's the reason why we adopt this quadratic adjustment cost in inputs. Now, one additional assumption here, or one additional modeling choice here, is that the producers are subject to a working capital constraint. Of Newmeyer and Perry, they show that this working capital constraint actually helps in capturing some dynamics of foreign emerging markets. So it's an side of the economy. Okay. So now let me go to explain the the financial side of the economy. Here we follow very closely Cristiano Moton Costaño, and the only thing is that role in the design of the contracts, but otherwise is the same mechanism. So very briefly, let me describe the mechanism. So imagine that we are so we have the timeline here, and this purple part is t-1, and the pink part is t. So we start in t-1 to tell the story. Goes and buys a kt-1 units of capital at a price qkt-1. To buy this capital, the entrepreneur needs to borrow money and needs to use its own net worth. So the borrowings of the total borrowings will be for the total value of capital that is buying minus the entrepreneur signs the contract. In the contract, they establish both the amount that is going to be repaid and the interest rate. And these are specified in US dollars for both the Mexican entrepreneur and the US entrepreneur. Therefore, the Mexican entrepreneur is fully exposed to the exchange rate. Okay. So the effective capital becomes omega times kt-1. With that product, effective capital, the entrepreneur and the producer determine the rental rate of capital. So the entrepreneur rents these effective units of capital and then after that production takes place, the entrepreneur collects all the undepreciated capital. So the entrepreneur collects the rents of the capital, and then the entrepreneur sells the entrepreneur has to collect the rents of the capital and has to repay the bond, the money that borrowed. So the return of this capital is going to be determined by omega, by the shot. There are going to be some entrepreneurs that are not be able to repay the loan, and they default, and some other entrepreneurs that receive a omega shock above this threshold, which then they get intervened by the financial intermediary, and their net worth basically goes to zero because the financial intermediary collects all the capital and sells the capital. Relevant credit market imperfection is the one of the international financial. Yes, So Alberto is asking if I need all these financial mechanism amplification. In a previous version of the paper, we didn't have all the financial intermediation side of the model, and only via the distortion, the distortion of the financial side of the economy. That by adding this financial mechanism, we actually improve in the dynamics that we obtain, that the model predicts from for the observables that we have, and so one of the again econometrically you can obtain that that spillovers by not without modeling the financial accelerator, but only considering the financial distortion that comes from the that the editor actually made us is that we take the trade channel very seriously, and we don't take the financial channel endogenously. So this is the reason why we endogenize this. There is another question. Countries. No, actually there are no cross-country correlations in the shocks that we model, and that was one modeling choice. We said, okay, we are not going to explain the correlations of Mexico and the U.S. That's not the preferred way to go. Actually, that correlation of shocks was one of the modeling approaches that Justiniano and Preston tried in their model. What they obtain when they correlate the from what their data was telling them. I'm sorry. So this is basically the mechanism we are borrowing from.
If people have access to a microphone, I can enable your microphones.
Improves the fit of the model during the Great Recession. That's actually true. Okay, so the user of capital is just following this. Standard law of motion capital with quadratic adjustment costs, and we allow for investment. The point that I want to make is that investment is also symmetric as the consumption basket, so it's, in essence is the same goods. You have that we have that investment is formed by a tradable rest of the world goods. So this is to also to show that there is a investment plays a dual role in the trade channel and also in the financial channel. Okay, I think I more or less explained this. So let me move on. That happens when the amount of debt is larger than the resources of the entrepreneur. In that case, the entrepreneur will default, and that depends on following Cristiano, we allow for this omega variance to be a shock. The optimal contract, just quickly let me summarize this. These are the revenues of the loans that are not paid after paying this monitoring cost mu. The financial intermediary gets whatever is left of the capital of the defaulting entrepreneur. And this is what the bank has to pay to the depositors. So, this is the second equation is the value or the expected value of the entrepreneur. The value of the debt. Obviously, the value of the entrepreneur that does default is 0, so is this here plus 0. And the optimal contract is designed to maximize the expected value of the entrepreneur, subject to the 0 profit. Device here. We assume that the exporter is actually also subject to a working capital constraint, and also the exporter receives a what we call a terms of trade. And the price in the US is going to be PH tilde, and this is the working capital additional cost. And this is the cost at which the exporter is buying these goods in Mexico, adjusted by the exchange rate, because this is in dollars. So the optimal price that we obtain here is that because we have the cost of the working capital constraint, and because we have what we call a terms of trade shock. So this goes back genously given by in the model, but we allow for a disturbance, an exogenous disturbance, because we know that international prices are determined in international markets, and not necessarily by these two economies. Finally, you say that
we can say around
that is GDP growth, which is
participants
an exogenous shock.
That next week we will
net imports
Columbia
also
University,
follow
talking
this process and adopt
if
process
banks
growth
alleviate
of
fiscal
GDP